The morning air in the airport buzzed with the usual noise of rolling suitcases' footsteps echoing off the polished floors, and the constant murmur of voices blended together in a cacophony of travel and anticipation. Among the crowd, one figure stood apart as she slowly made her way toward the gate, her every step deliberate, and measured the soft tap of her cane, a rhythmic sound that somehow managed to cut through the noise around her. She didn't rush, nor did she appear lost in the chaotic scene of hurried passengers and bustling workers. There was a certain calmness about her, as though time itself bent around her, and she walked in a world where things moved just a little slower. She didn't seem bothered by the chaos around her. Her eyes were focused on the path ahead, her pace unhurried. And when she reached the counter to present her boarding pass, she was greeted by a young flight attendant who barely looked up from her phone. The attendant mumbled a quick hello as she scanned the ticket before motioning her towards the gate. The elderly woman nodded graciously and walked past as if the entire interaction had been a mere formality, the attendant's attention never fully leaving her screen. She had other things on her mind, other passengers to deal with, more pressing matters to attend to. The elderly woman didn't mind. She had learned long ago that people often didn't see her. They saw only what they wanted to see, but it didn't matter. She had places to be, and the world she moved in was not the world of rushing crowds and impatient faces. She made her way down the jet bridge and boarded the plane, the young flight attendant still glued to her phone, barely noticing as she entered first class. With a quiet grace, she sat down by the window, her gaze drifting out to the view of the tarmac. As she settled into her seat, she took a deep breath and smiled as if she were waiting for something, but not in any rush to see it arrive. The flight attendant finally noticed her again as she prepared the cabin for departure, her eyes glancing over the elderly woman sitting there with a perfect posture, her grey hair neatly combed into a chignon, her hands folded in her lap, in a way that suggested she had travelled this route many times before without any need for help or assistance. The flight attendant sighed inwardly. She was already behind schedule and had to deal with more pressing things than an old woman who probably just wanted to sleep through the flight. The elderly woman caught her eye for a moment, but didn't say anything. She was content to watch the world outside the window. The flight attendant barely acknowledged her, but as the plane started to taxi down the runway, she couldn't help but notice how calm the woman appeared, how composed and unbothered by the hustle and bustle around her. It was almost as though she was entirely separate from the madness of the airport, the noise of the passengers, and the constant movement of the plane. It was as if she were in her own world, a world that no one else could touch. As the flight ascended into the sky, the elderly woman's mind wandered, but not to places of worry or stress. She was used to long flights, used to the feeling of the earth growing distant below her, and the sensation of weightlessness that came with it. Her thoughts drifted slowly as the attendant began her rounds, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. Her eyes flicked toward the elderly woman. A brief moment of impatience flashed across her face as she noticed the woman's small request, a pillow and blanket. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough to make her sigh inwardly and mutter a quick response. She would handle it quickly and move on, but the elderly woman's eyes held something else, an unspoken challenge, a calm assurance that made the flight attendant hesitate for just a moment before she grabbed the items and headed back to her. The elderly woman sat perfectly still, waiting for the moment that would come. She knew how this would play out. She had seen it before. The young flight attendant would rush through her duties, never fully acknowledging her or offering the courtesy expected. She was a woman used to being overlooked, but the time was near when the young woman would see just how wrong she had been. The elderly woman's gaze remained fixed outside the window as the flight attendant walked away, the small smile on her lips never wavering. The flight attendant returned shortly after with the requested pillow and blanket, her steps quick and impatient as she dropped the items onto the seat next to the elderly woman. Without a word, her fingers brushing against the fabric, almost carelessly, as she turned away to continue her rounds. She didn't even notice the small shift in the elderly woman's posture, the subtle change in the air around her. As she took the blanket and carefully arranged it over her lap, she moved with slow precision, as if each movement was part of some unspoken ritual. And for a moment, the young flight attendant felt something unsettling in the way the elderly woman handled the simplest of things with such grace and purpose. But she didn't linger on it. She had too much to do and passengers to attend to. As the plane leveled out in the air, the atmosphere in first class settled into a quiet hum. The elderly woman sat still, her eyes tracing the flight path through the small window beside her, as though she could see beyond the clouds to some faraway place, a place of memories or long-forgotten moments. The flight attendant continued with her duties, but something felt off in the way she moved. The usual confidence in her steps was replaced by a slight tension that she couldn't shake. It was as though she was being watched in a way that made her skin prickle. At first, she dismissed the feeling as nothing more than nerves, but it lingered just beneath the surface. She tried to focus on the task at hand, offering drinks to the other first-class passengers, smiling brightly as she did so, but her eyes kept drifting back to the elderly woman who sat silently, staring into the distance. Each time their gazes met, there was a flicker of something unspoken, the elderly woman's eyes sharp yet calm, like they held a depth the flight attendant couldn't fathom. She didn't understand why, but the tension in her chest grew with each passing minute. The woman's presence felt too powerful, too composed to be dismissed as an ordinary passenger. Then came the moment the elderly woman pressed the call button. Just once. It was a quiet sound, but it sliced through the air in a way that demanded attention. The flight attendant hesitated for a second, her eyes darting around as she glanced at the other passengers, before making her way to the woman's seat. Once more, there was something unnerving in the way the elderly woman didn't ask with urgency or desperation. It was simply a soft press of a button, a request made without expectation, yet there was an undeniable weight to it. The flight attendant approached with her usual forced smile, but as she neared the woman, she felt her breath catch in her throat. There was a chill in the air. Now something she couldn't explain. The elderly woman's eyes never wavered from her. They were calm, but intense, in a way that made the young attendant feel small despite the difference in age between them. The flight attendant stopped beside the woman's seat and waited for her to speak, but the elderly woman simply looked at her and nodded slightly as though giving her permission to help. It was then that the attendant realized the woman had asked for nothing beyond a small drink of water, yet she felt an odd sense of discomfort, as if this simple request carried with it some hidden meaning, something she couldn't put her finger on. She bent down to grab the glass of water from the cart and returned it to the elderly woman, her hand shaking slightly as she passed it over their fingers, brushing for a brief moment. The elderly woman's touch was soft but firm, and for just a fraction of a second, the flight attendant thought she saw something flicker in her eyes, a deep knowing that unsettled her to the core. But she dismissed it quickly with a smile and turned to walk away. But as she did so, she heard the woman's voice softly calling after her. "Thank you, dear. I do hope you have a pleasant rest of your day." The words were kind, but there was a certain weight to them, a hint of something that made the flight attendant pause in her tracks and turn around. Her instincts screamed at her to move on, to keep going, but for some reason she couldn't tear her eyes away from the elderly woman. The look on her face was serene, but there was something else there, a quiet power that the flight attendant couldn't understand. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say a word, the elderly woman spoke again. "You know, dear, sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that make the biggest difference." The flight attendant froze. Her heart skipped a beat as the woman's gaze met hers once more. This time, the connection was different. It wasn't just the gaze of a passenger and a flight attendant. It felt like something deeper, something more meaningful, like the elderly woman had seen straight into her soul, and in that moment the young flight attendant couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt well up inside her, as if she had already done something wrong without even realizing it. But before she could process the thought, the elderly woman looked away and returned to gazing out the window, her demeanor unchanged. The moment had passed just as quickly as it had arrived, and the flight attendant was left standing there unsure of what had just happened, yet feeling the weight of it in a way she couldn't explain. The flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as she continued her rounds. The elderly woman's words seemed to echo in her mind like a soft whisper that grew louder with each passing minute. Sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that make the biggest difference. The flight attendant tried to push it aside, but no matter how hard she focused on the other passengers, it was the elderly woman's presence that lingered in the back of her mind, the way her calm gaze had met hers earlier, how it felt as though she had seen right through her, as if she were reading her every thought. The discomfort that had started as a subtle unease now settled deeper into her chest, and she couldn't explain why her hands trembled slightly as she handed out drinks to the other passengers in first class. But the elderly woman remained silent, and still her eyes never leaving the window, as if she were lost in a world of her own. Time seemed to drag as the flight moved onward, the tension in the air thickening with every minute. The flight attendant found herself stealing glances at the woman, more frequently her curiosity getting the best of her. Though she never let her gaze linger too long, she couldn't understand why the woman had such an effect on her, why someone so quiet and seemingly insignificant could make her feel this way. But the longer she observed her, the more she began to feel that there was something more to her, something hidden beneath the surface that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Maybe it was the way she seemed untouched by the turbulence of the flight, her hands steady as they rested on her lap, or the way she sat with perfect posture, as though she had an air of authority that no one else could see. Maybe it was the strange confidence that radiated from her even without saying a word. The flight attendant couldn't stop herself from walking by her seat. Once more her heart skipped a beat when she saw that the woman's eyes were now closed, her face serene, as though she were napping. But there was something unsettling about it, the way she was so still, so composed. It didn't seem like a simple rest. It was almost as though she were waiting for something to happen. The flight attendant tried to focus on the other passengers, but her gaze kept drifting back to the elderly woman, who now seemed like the calm center of a storm. As the minutes ticked by, she felt her unease grow. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she was being watched even when she wasn't near the woman's seat. It was as if there was an invisible thread connecting them, pulling her attention back again and again. It wasn't long before the flight attendant found herself standing by the elderly woman's seat. Once more this time, she had no reason to be there other than an inexplicable urge to check on her. Maybe it was the fact that the woman had remained so silent, so calm, through everything, or maybe it was the odd sense of guilt that crept up every time she thought about their brief exchange earlier. She took a deep breath before walking over, but as she approached the woman's seat, something in the air shifted. The temperature seemed to drop just slightly. A chill ran down the flight attendant's spine. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But before she could turn away, the elderly woman's eyes fluttered open and locked with hers. The connection was instant, the same gaze from earlier, now even more intense, and the flight attendant felt a wave of discomfort crash over her. The elderly woman didn't speak at first, but there was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that made the flight attendant want to look away. But she couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, as if the woman's gaze had paralyzed her in place. She stood frozen for a moment longer than she should have before the elderly woman finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "It's hard to hide who you really are, isn't it, dear?" The flight attendant blinked. Her mind raced, trying to understand the meaning behind the words. They were simple enough, But the way they were said, the weight they carried, made her feel as though she were being exposed somehow, as though the woman could see straight into her soul and was speaking directly to something hidden there, something she didn't want to acknowledge. She took a step back, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt in that moment. She had no response, no words to offer, as she tried to regain her composure. But the elderly woman didn't wait for her to reply. She simply returned to looking out the window, her eyes closing again, as if the conversation had ended just as quickly as it had begun. The flight attendant stood there for a few more seconds, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over her, but it clung to her like a shadow. Something she couldn't escape the rest of the flight seemed to drag on the weight of the elderly woman's words heavy in her mind. As she moved from one task to another, she tried to push it out of her thoughts, but every time she glanced over at the woman sitting so still and composed, she felt that same unsettling feeling creeping up her spine, and she couldn't shake it no matter how hard she tried. The quiet stillness in the woman's presence was becoming unbearable, and yet she knew something was coming, something was about to happen that would change everything. The flight attendant could feel the weight of the moment. Long after she walked away from the elderly woman, her heart was still pounding in her chest, the woman's words echoing in her mind. "It's hard to hide who you really are, isn't it, dear?" The words seemed simple enough, but the way they were spoken left her unsettled. She hadn't meant to stay there so long. She had to finish her rounds. The other passengers were waiting, but the moment had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She tried to brush it off, tried to focus on the other passengers, but something kept pulling her back to that quiet seat by the window where the elderly woman sat so still, as though she were waiting for something or someone. The flight attendant moved through the cabin as if in a daze. She refilled drinks and adjusted the overhead compartments, but her mind wasn't on her tasks. It was on that moment, when the woman's eyes had locked with hers, a moment when time had seemed to slow down, and she couldn't escape the sense of being seen in a way she never wanted anyone to see her. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable, in a way she couldn't quite explain. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that the elderly woman was watching her still. Even though her gaze was fixed outside the window, the flight attendant could almost feel her eyes on her every move, and it unsettled her. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. The chatter of passengers, the hum of the engines, all faded into the background as she moved through the motions of her duties, the feeling of being watched never leaving her. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so on edge, so self-conscious. Every time she passed by the elderly woman's seat, she felt a shiver run down her spine, as if the woman was silently judging her, or perhaps waiting for something to happen. The tension between them was palpable, and it was beginning to get to her. The woman never asked for anything else, just sat there in silence, yet somehow her presence commanded attention in a way that left the flight attendant feeling small and insignificant. Then came the moment when the elderly woman pressed the call button again. This time it was different. It wasn't the soft, polite request from earlier. It was almost as if the woman knew exactly when to do it, and the flight attendant could feel the air around her shift as soon as she heard it. The small chime cutting through the silence like a warning. She hesitated for a moment, standing still as the call button blinked in front of her. It was as if the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting for her to move, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to go over there again. She didn't want to face that gaze again, the way it made her feel exposed. But she had to do her job. She had no choice, so with a deep breath, she walked over to the woman's seat, her hands slightly trembling as she approached. This time, when she stopped beside the elderly woman, there was no word of greeting, no polite exchange, just a quiet tension that filled the space between them. The woman's eyes remained closed, as if she hadn't even noticed her approaching, but somehow the flight attendant knew she was still aware of everything. She could feel it in the air, the heavy silence that seemed to hang around them. She waited for a moment longer before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Can I help you with something else?" The elderly woman didn't open her eyes, but her lips curled into a slight smile, her voice soft but unmistakable as she replied, "You've already helped me, dear, more than you know." The flight attendant swallowed hard, her stomach tightening at the words, the strange undertone in the woman's voice making her uneasy once again. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to say something to break the tension, but nothing came out, so she simply nodded and turned to leave. But before she could take a step away, the elderly woman spoke again. "You should be careful with how you treat others. Sometimes you never know who they really are." The words hit her like a jolt of electricity, her breath catching in her throat. As the gravity of them settled over her, for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the world had tilted on its axis, and she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't understand. The flight attendant didn't know what to say. She wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She turned and walked away, her mind spinning with confusion and dread. What did the woman mean? Who was she really? As she made her way back to the front of the cabin, she felt the strange sensation of eyes on her again, the chill running down her spine, as if the elderly woman's gaze had never left her. Even though she couldn't see her face anymore, the tension between them had shifted into something else, something she couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried, the rest of the flight passed in a blur, but the unease never left her. It lingered in the pit of her stomach, a growing sense that something was coming, something she wasn't prepared for. The flight attendant couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered in her chest as she walked back down the aisle. The words the elderly woman had spoken echoed in her mind. "You should be careful with how you treat others. Sometimes you never know who they really are." The flight attendant had heard phrases like that before, but never in such a way, not with that weight, not with that underlying sense of warning that seemed to hang in the air around her, like a storm cloud threatening to break the rest of her duties. Passed in a haze, her hands moved through the motions, but her mind wasn't there. She kept glancing back toward first class, her eyes darting toward the seat by the window, where the elderly woman still sat, staring out into the nothingness of the sky. It was as if she was looking for something that no one else could see, as if she had been waiting all along for the moment to arrive. But what moment? Was it the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow involved in whatever it was that was coming next, and it terrified her. She finished her rounds and returned to the galley in the back of the plane, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. But she couldn't stop herself from glancing toward the front of the cabin, her eyes locked on the elderly woman once again. She was so still, so calm, and it made the flight attendant's skin crawl. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening, why this woman seemed to have such an effect on her, why she couldn't shake the sensation that something was about to happen. She needed to focus, she needed to stay professional. But the nagging feeling in her gut told her that something had shifted, something was different about this flight, and she was somehow caught in its pull. Time seemed to slow down as the hours passed, and the flight continued its steady course across the sky, the tension in the air thickening with each passing moment. The flight attendant could feel it growing stronger, like a force building, and she didn't know how to stop it. The silence between her and the elderly woman was unbearable. Now every glance felt like a tug of war, pulling at her nerves. Her thoughts scrambled in her head, but she couldn't find a way to release the pressure. She tried to busy herself with small tasks, cleaning the coffee station, rearranging the beverage cart. But it didn't help. She kept returning to the woman's quiet seat, to that calm, composed figure, staring out the window so still. And yet there was something in her presence that made the flight attendant feel like she was teetering on the edge of something dark and unknown. And then it happened. The flight attendant was standing at the front of the cabin when a strange feeling washed over her. It was as though the entire plane had shifted all at once, as though the world had tilted on its axis. And in that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. She knew something was wrong. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it deep in her bones, a shift in the air, a change in the atmosphere, as if the energy of the plane had suddenly changed. She turned toward the back of the cabin. instinctively looking for something, anything to explain the unease that gripped her. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing, except the fact that the elderly woman was no longer in her seat. Her place by the window was empty, and a rush of panics surged through the flight attendant's chest. She'd have been so distracted by the woman's presence that she hadn't noticed when she'd left. When had she moved? When had she stood up? It didn't make sense. The woman hadn't gotten up once throughout the entire flight, and yet now her seat was empty, and the flight attendant's heart began to race. She moved quickly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the cabin. She checked the other first-class seats, but the elderly woman wasn't there either. The panic started to rise in her throat. She felt dizzy, as though the walls of the plane were closing in around her. What was going on? Where had she gone? Her breath quickened as she made her way to the rear of the plane. But she found no sign of her. The cabin was quiet, eerily so, and it only deepened her sense of dread. She stopped in the galley for a moment, trying to steady herself. But her mind was spinning. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't understand what was happening. And yet she knew that something had changed, something had shifted, and she was in the middle of it. She rushed back down the aisle, her eyes scanning every corner of the plane, looking for any sign of the elderly woman. But there was nothing. The plane was still quiet, the passengers still in their seats, unaware of the sudden change in the air. Then she reached the front again, and there at the window sat the woman, as though she had never moved at all. The flight attendant froze in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman was back in her seat, as though nothing had happened, her calm gaze fixed outside the window, not acknowledging the flight attendant at all, not even looking up to meet her eyes. She was still as composed as ever, as if she had never left, and the flight attendant stood there breathless, trying to process the impossible scene unfolding in front of her. The flight attendant could feel the weight of the elderly woman's words pressing down on her with every step. She took down the narrow aisle of the plane. Her heart was still racing, her breath shallow and quick, as though the air around her had thickened and became harder to breathe. The woman's cryptic statement echoed in her mind over and over and over again. I have seen things you couldn't even begin to imagine. And one day you'll understand why you crossed paths with me today. Those words felt like a secret, a hidden truth that she wasn't meant to know, but couldn't escape. And the more she thought about them, the more she felt herself sinking deeper into a pit of unease. She had never felt anything like this in her life, not even on the busiest flights, not even on the most turbulent journeys. Could she remember feeling so caught up in something she couldn't understand, so trapped within the weight of someone else's unspoken knowledge? She had to focus, she had to do her job. But it was impossible now. The tension in the cabin was too thick. It was too much to ignore the feeling that something was wrong, that something was lurking just out of sight. She returned to the galley once again to try and collect herself, but it didn't help. Her hands were still shaking, her mind still spinning. She had to do something, anything, to distract herself, to regain control. But there was nothing she could do. The words kept coming back again and again, like an endless loop, and the strangest part was that it wasn't just the woman's words that bothered her. It was her eyes too, those eyes that seemed to know too much about her, too much about the world. It felt like she was standing in the presence of something ancient, something that had seen everything and had been through more than anyone could fathom. The thought terrified her, but she couldn't shake it. It clung to her like a shadow. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to clear her mind, but the images wouldn't go away. She saw the elderly woman's face again, saw the calm serenity in her expression, the almost knowing look that made the flight attendant feel exposed, as though the woman had peeled back the layers of her soul and seen all the secrets buried deep inside. And as much as she tried to push it away, she couldn't stop thinking about it. What if the woman was telling the truth? What if there was more to her than just a simple passenger? What if she had been warning her of something bigger, something she couldn't see yet, something that was coming for them all? The flight attendant felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the reality of the situation began to settle in. She needed to calm down. She needed to pull herself together. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let this strange encounter throw her off course. But it was impossible to ignore it, was impossible to pretend like everything was normal when her mind was screaming at her that something was terribly wrong. She couldn't stop glancing at the elderly woman's seat. Every time she walked past it, she couldn't help but feel as though the woman was watching her, even when she wasn't looking, as if her presence was still lingering in the air. Time seemed to crawl by the rest of the flight, felt like an eternity. The flight attendant continued to move through the cabin, checking on the passengers. But her mind was elsewhere every step. She took every action she performed felt mechanical, like she was going through the motions without really being present. The unease gnawed at her stomach, making her feel lightheaded and distant. She didn't know how much longer she could take it, how much longer she could pretend like everything was fine when her instincts were screaming that it wasn't. And then there was another change. She didn't see it happen, but it was undeniable the moment the cabin door had closed and the seatbelt signs had been switched off. The atmosphere shifted again. It was subtle at first, but the flight attendant felt it. It was like the whole plane had exhaled at once, like a wave of tension had lifted, only it didn't feel like relief. It felt like something was waiting to happen, like the calm before a storm, and suddenly she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold, that whatever had been set into motion the moment she had crossed paths with the elderly woman was finally going to make itself known. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The sense of impending danger was so strong now. It was almost suffocating. She walked through the cabin, faster than before, her pace quickening. As the pressure continued to build, she knew she had to stay alert, stay sharp. But it felt impossible to focus. Her thoughts were scattered and fragmented. The image of the elderly woman's face burned in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it, she couldn't escape it. The woman's warning, the strange confidence in her voice, the sense that she knew something the flight attendant didn't and could never understand. And then there was a sudden jolt, a sharp movement that made the plane shake. Everyone's heads snapped toward the windows as the flight attendant stumbled to catch her balance. A cold rush of air seemed to sweep through the cabin. The plane seemed to drop for a brief moment before stabilizing again. But it wasn't just the turbulence, it was the feeling in the air. The tension had thickened to the point that it felt like it was pressing down on them, like the walls were closing in. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat as she scanned the cabin. The passengers were looking around confused, but there was something in the air, something they couldn't see yet. But she could feel it deep in her bones. The flight attendant stumbled back against the galley wall, trying to steady herself after the sudden jolt that had shaken the plane. Her heart raced as her eyes flicked to the windows. The passengers were all looking around in confusion. But it wasn't just the turbulence that made her uneasy, it was the shift in the air, the feeling that something unseen was moving through the cabin, something she couldn't explain. No one else seemed to notice the odd atmosphere, but she could feel it pressing down on her like a weight, suffocating her every movement. She couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, something had changed, and it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. The elderly woman's words returned to her again and again, haunting her every thought. I have seen things you couldn't even begin to imagine. And one day you'll understand why you crossed paths with me today. The flight attendant's stomach churned with dread, her mind racing to understand what the woman had meant. But the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. It was as if the answers were just out of reach, teasing her, but never fully revealing themselves. As she moved down the aisle once again, her hands trembling, she couldn't escape the feeling that the elderly woman was somehow at the center of it all. She was the catalyst for whatever was happening now. The woman had disappeared once, but now she was back, sitting in her seat once again, as though nothing had happened. Yet the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched, that the woman's eyes were on her, even when they weren't. The tension between them was palpable. Every glance she caught of the elderly woman felt like a silent challenge, a warning that she couldn't understand. And the more she tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at her insides like a constant itch she couldn't scratch. Her breath came in short gasps as she reached the front of the plane again, trying to compose herself. But the unease only grew stronger with each passing minute. It was as if the plane had become a pressure cooker slowly building up to an explosion. She could feel it in her chest, the way her heart hammered at her ribs, the way the air felt too thick to breathe. She glanced toward the cockpit door, and then back at the first-class section, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. But everything seemed unnaturally still. The passengers sat in their seats, watching the flight attendants move up and down the aisle, but none of them seemed aware of the strange tension that had overtaken the cabin. No one else could feel it. The flight attendant knew that. But she couldn't escape it. No matter how hard she tried, she was trapped in a cage of her own fear and confusion. And then, without warning, it happened again. Another sharp jolt, this time stronger than the last. The plane lurched violently, and the flight attendants were thrown off balance. A few of the passengers gasped, and the flight attendant caught herself against the side of the aisle, her breath catching in her throat. The entire plane seemed to shake, as if something was pushing against it from the outside, something big, something powerful. And for a moment, the flight attendant couldn't breathe. She could feel the air around her thickening, as though the very atmosphere was being sucked out of the cabin. She looked around in a panic, searching for an explanation. But none came. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, and the passengers were whispering to each other. The flight attendant's mind raced. What was going on? Why was the plane shaking like this? And why did it feel as though the world was shifting around her, as though everything was changing, and she couldn't catch up? The elderly woman had become a shadow in the back of the flight attendant's mind, but now it was impossible to ignore. The unease only seemed to grow stronger the moment the turbulence stopped. It didn't feel like it was over. It felt like the calm before a storm. The flight attendant's pulse pounded in her ears as she walked down the aisle again, her eyes scanning the passengers, but her mind kept returning to the elderly woman sitting by the window. The woman had been so calm, so composed through all of this, and yet something in her stillness unsettled the flight attendant more than anything else. Had the way she didn't react to the turbulence, the way she seemed to be waiting for something to happen, something the flight attendant didn't understand. She felt her breath catch again, and her stomach churn as she reached the woman's seat. The woman was still sitting there, eyes fixed outside the window, as though nothing in the world could disturb her, not the turbulence, not the strange energy that had taken hold of the plane. She wanted to speak to her, ask her what was happening, ask her if she knew what was going on, but the words stuck in her throat, as though something was preventing her from asking the questions that needed to be asked. Something about the woman's presence had paralyzed her, made her feel as though she couldn't move, couldn't speak. Without breaking some unspoken rule, the flight attendant stood there frozen, staring at the woman, wondering if she could somehow find the answers she so desperately needed, or if the woman would only offer more cryptic words that would leave her even more confused than before. And then, as if sensing her presence, the elderly woman turned slowly, her gaze finally meeting the flight attendant's eyes. It was as if time had stopped for a moment, and all the noise of the plane faded away. It was just the two of them locked in a silent exchange, and the woman's lips parted slightly as though she were about to say something, but no sound came at first. The flight attendant held her breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the woman would speak. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the elderly woman whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "You're not ready yet, but soon you will be, and when that time comes you'll understand." The flight attendant felt a chill run down her spine as she tried to process the woman's words, her head spinning. The unease, now more intense than ever before. The flight was no longer just a job. It had become something much bigger, something she couldn't escape. And she knew that whatever was coming, she was already caught in its grip.